They say every marriage has its tests. My test came on a luxury yacht, surrounded by the man I loved and his wealthy family. And I failed spectacularly. Or so he thought. The gift he gave me that day wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration of war. A war he was not prepared to lose so badly. This is the story of how I took back my dignity. If you believe self-respect is non-negotiable, hit that subscribe button, because you're in the right place. The champagne flute felt cold and impossibly elegant in my hand. It was delicate, thin-stemmed, and probably worth more than my entire set of kitchen knives back home. Out here, cruising somewhere off the Florida Keys, the late afternoon sun was a brilliant, warm weight on my shoulders, and the sea was a shade of deep turquoise I'd only ever seen on postcards. The yacht, which Harvey casually referred to as the boat, cut through the water with a low, confident hum. It wasn't a roar, it was the purr of a well-fed predator. A sound that money makes effortless, constant, and utterly sure of its own power. I felt like I was living inside a movie. A glossy magazine spread come to life. And if I was being completely honest with myself, a feeling that was getting harder to ignore these days. I also felt like a fraud. My floral sundress, the one I'd spent 3 weeks agonizing over before splurging, had felt so perfectly right in the department store dressing room. It was the most expensive piece of clothing I owned. But out here, under the discerning gaze of Harvey's family, it suddenly seemed flimsy. Like a child's craft project. The fabric felt too thin. The print a little too loud. I found myself unconsciously tugging at the hem. A nervous tic I thought I'd lost in high school. Trying to make the dress look more substantial than it was. Harvey, my husband of just over a year, was across the deck, laughing with his father. It was a loud, booming laugh. A sound designed to fill a space and claim it. He was a master at that. He caught my eye from across the deck and gave me a brilliant white smile. The kind that had charmed me off my feet on our first date. I tried to mirror it, to make my own smile look as easy and natural as his. But the muscles in my face felt stiff, uncooperative. The smile I produced felt more like a grimace. His family was scattered around the gleaming teak deck like chess pieces on a board. His mother, Eleanor, held court under the shade of a large white canopy, a silk scarf tied artfully around her neck, hiding whatever wrinkles dared to exist. When I first came aboard, her eyes, a cool and distant gray, had performed a slow, deliberate scan of my entire being, from my simple sandals to the way I'd tied my hair. A tiny, almost imperceptible frown line had appeared between her perfectly sculpted brows before her face smoothed back into its default, setting a mask of polite, glacial indifference. That was Eleanor's way. Her displeasure was never spoken aloud. It was delivered in 1,000 tiny cuts of silence, in the subtle arch of an eyebrow, in a glance that lingered just a second too long. Earlier, she had drifted over to me, her perfume arriving a moment before she did. "Jessica, dear," she'd said, her voice smooth as polished marble. "Harvey tells me you're still working at that little bookshop." "It's a publishing house, Eleanor," I had replied, trying to keep my own voice even. "I'm an assistant editor." "Ah." She had given a small, tight nod, as if I'd just told her I collected bottle caps for a living. How quaint! And then she had drifted away, leaving the word quaint hanging in the air between us, smelling of condescension. Harvey's older brother, Michael, and his wife, Chloe, were there too? Chloe and I were closer in age, And sometimes, in unguarded moments, I'd catch a flicker of something like weary understanding in her eyes. But she had married into this family 8 years before I did. She had learned the rules, paid her dues. The primary rule seemed to be keep your head down, smile, and never, ever make a scene. When I'd tried to catch her eye after Eleanor's comment, she'd given me a small, tight-lipped wave before her gaze immediately dropped back to the screen of her phone, a fortress of digital privacy. The afternoon wore on in a hazy, suffocating bubble of small talk and the gentle clinking of ice in glasses. I mostly listened, a professional nodder, trying to keep track of conversations that flew over my head like migratory birds, discussions about leveraged buyouts, the nuances of sailing in the Aegean Sea, the outrageous cost of yacht maintenance. I felt a familiar tension coiling in the pit of my stomach. It was the feeling of being constantly evaluated and of taking a test I hadn't studied for, knowing that one wrong word, one misplaced fork, I could confirm their unspoken suspicions and brand me forever as the outsider I was. Then, just as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, melting into a spectacular palette of orange and pink, Harvey clapped his hands together. The sound was sharp, decisive, silencing the low hum of conversation instantly. "All right, everyone," he said, his voice booming with a showman's flair. "Since I have my favorite people all in one place, I thought it would be the perfect time for a little something I've put together." A murmur of polite anticipation went through the small crowd. Harvey thrived on this, on being the center of attention, the grand benefactor. He disappeared for a moment into the main cabin and returned with several large, exquisitely wrapped boxes, all bearing the logos of brands I could only dream of affording. My heart, despite itself, gave a little flutter of warmth. This was the Harvey who had swept me off my feet, the generous, charming man who believed any problem could be solved with a grand gesture. "Just a little something to show my sincere appreciation," he announced, puffing out his chest slightly. "For the most important people in my life." He said it while looking around at everyone. But for a brief, significant second, his eyes met mine, and he winked. The knot of tension in my stomach magically eased. A dizzying rush of love and gratitude washed over me, so potent it almost made me forget Eleanor's comment. I was one of them. He saw me. I belonged here. He started with his father, presenting him with a heavy, dark wooden box. Inside was a bottle of Macallan 30-year-old Scotch. His dad, a man of few words, actually grunted in appreciation. A rare sign of genuine pleasure. "Good man," he said, clapping Harvey firmly on the shoulder. Next was Eleanor. Her gift was a long, flat box from Hermès. She opened it with delicate, almost surgical precision, revealing a silk scarf in a cascade of vibrant, abstract colors. She didn't smile. I wasn't sure I'd ever seen her truly smile, but she gave a curt, satisfied nod. "It's lovely." "Harvey." "Thank you." For Michael and Chloe. He presented 2 matching black boxes from Tag Heuer. They opened them to reveal a pair of sleek, impossibly handsome watches. Chloe's polite mask finally broke into a real, dazzling smile, one that reached her eyes. "Oh, Harvey, it's beautiful. You really shouldn't have." "Nonsense." He beamed, soaking in their praise like a plant soaking in sunlight. "Only the best for my family." And then, it was my turn. The deck, which had been buzzing with appreciative murmurs, fell completely quiet. It was a sudden, heavy silence, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. All eyes turned to me. Harvey's smile was wider than ever, stretched taut across his face. It was a predator's smile. A wolf's smile, though I wouldn't have the language to name it until much later. He reached into the pocket of his linen trousers, not into the nearly empty gift bag at his feet. My own smile faltered, a flicker of confusion clouding my relief. "And for my lovely wife," he said, his voice dropping into a tone of mock intimacy. "Something to make sure you always remember where you belong. Honey." He held out his hand, lying on his tanned, open palm wasn't a velvet box. It was a thin, cheap-looking plastic bracelet. It was a garish, offensive shade of corporate blue. The kind of promotional garbage you get for free at a trade show and throw away before you even get back to your car. Embossed on the side in stark white letters was the name of his family's company. I could see the faint, uneven lines from the plastic mold it had been pressed in. A hot, tidal wave of shame washed over me. So intense. I felt dizzy. The sound of the waves, the distant cry of a seagull, the light chatter from moments before it all faded into a dull, humming roar in my ears. The only thing I could hear was the frantic, panicked pounding of my own heart against my ribs. A trapped bird trying to escape. I could feel their eyes on me, sharp and clinical. Eleanor had a tiny, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. A couple of his cousins, lounging on the other side of the deck, were trying and failing to hide their snickers behind their hands. I risked a glance at Chloe, my last hope, begging her with my eyes for some sign of solidarity. But she was suddenly intensely interested in the intricate clasp of her new watch. Her face a careful, impenetrable blank. She wouldn't meet my gaze. My throat felt tight. Rav. As if it were closing up. I knew I had to say something. Do something. I reached out, my hand trembling so badly I was afraid I'd drop it. I took the bracelet from his palm. The plastic felt flimsy and cold against my skin. A stark, insulting contrast to the warmth of the setting sun on my back. "Thank you." I managed to choke out. The words felt like swallowing broken glass. I forced my shaking fingers to work, to slide the cheap band onto my wrist, where it sat. A bright, ugly shackle, a symbol of my ultimate humiliation. Harvey roared with laughter. A huge, theatrical sound that seemed to shatter the quiet evening air. "See, now you're officially part of the team." I tried to join in, to produce a laugh that sounded light and carefree, as if I were in on the joke. But what came out was a strangled little gasp. A sound of pure pain. I needed to get away. I needed air. I needed to not be looked at for one single second longer. "If you'll all excuse me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I stood up on legs that felt like they were made of jelly. "I just need to use the restroom." I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked, my movements stiff and robotic, towards the cabin door. I could feel the weight of their collective gaze on my back. A physical pressure. I fumbled with the heavy brass latch, my fingers feeling clumsy and useless. Finally, the door swung open, and I slipped inside, shutting it firmly behind me. The click of the lock sounding like a gunshot in the sudden silence. The cabin was cool and quiet. I leaned my back against the rich, polished wood of the door, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I looked down at the hideous blue band on my wrist, and then the tears I had been desperately, furiously holding back, began to fall. Hot and silent, tracing paths down my cheeks. I slid down the door until I was sitting on the plush, cream-colored carpet, burying my face in my hands, my shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in a fog of shame. But eventually, a sharp, impatient rap on the door made me jump, my heart leaping into my throat. "Jess, you okay in there?" "Honey," it was Harvey. But his voice held no trace of actual concern. It was flat, annoyed. The voice of a man whose fun was being interrupted. "Open up. You're being dramatic." His voice, laced with an unmistakable edge of irritation, cut through the thick fog of my misery. "Open up. You're being dramatic." Dramatic. The word landed like a slap. For a moment, I just sat there on the floor, the plush carpet doing little to soften the bone-deep chill that had settled over me. He wasn't worried. He was annoyed. My pain was an inconvenience, a disruption to his perfectly curated evening. A fresh wave of tears threatened. But something else rose with it, a tiny, sharp spark of anger. It was enough. It was the fuel I needed to move. I pushed myself up, my legs unsteady, and walked to the small, ornate vanity. I looked at my reflection. My face was blotchy, my eyes red and swollen. I looked broken. I splashed cold water on my face, the shock of it helping to ground me. I took one deep, shuddering breath, then another. Then I walked to the door, turned the heavy brass lock, and pulled it open. Harvey was leaning against the opposite wall of the narrow hallway, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, his expression one of pure exasperation. "Finally, what was all that about?" I crossed my arms over my chest. A subconscious barrier. The cheap plastic bracelet dug into my skin. "What was that about?" I repeated, my voice quiet but shaking with a force I didn't know I possessed. "You seriously don't know?" He sighed. A long, put-upon sound, and pushed himself off the wall. He walked into the cabin, forcing me to step back. The room, which had seemed spacious just an hour before, suddenly felt claustrophobically small. "Look, Jess." It was a joke. A stupid joke. "Okay, I get it. Maybe it wasn't the right time. But my God. You can't fall apart every time I tease you a little." "Tease me," the words came out sharper than I intended. "Harvey. You handed me a piece of corporate garbage in front of your entire family after giving them designer watches and $1,000 gifts. That's not teasing. That was a statement." He threw his hands up in the air. "A statement about what? That you're part of the family. That you're on the team." I thought it was funny. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "You know, sometimes I think you forget how good you have it. You're on a multi-million-dollar yacht. For Christ's sake, most people would be a little more grateful. I'm constantly buying you nice things. Does none of that count?" His words hit their mark, winding me. The anger flickered, replaced by a familiar, sickening wave of self-doubt. Was he right? Was I being ungrateful? Was I the one who was wrong? Who couldn't take a joke? I looked at the luxurious cabin around me, the polished mahogany walls, the king-sized bed with its impossibly high thread count sheets. He was right. My life with him was one of incredible privilege. A world away from the tiny apartment and ramen noodle budget of my single life. Maybe I was just being sensitive. I didn't have an answer for him. I just stood there, mute, staring at the floor, feeling the fight drain out of me. The plastic bracelet on my wrist felt heavier than ever. A brand marking me not just as an outsider, but as an ungrateful one. Seeing my silence. He took it as a victory. His tone softened. "Look, I'm sorry if your feelings got hurt," he said, the apology sounding hollow and rehearsed. "Let's just drop it. Come back out on the deck." They're opening another bottle of champagne. He didn't wait for my answer. Just turned and walked out, leaving the door ajar. An unspoken command. I didn't follow. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress sighing under my weight. I stayed there for a long time, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter from the deck. Each burst of it felt like a personal insult. Later that evening, seeking a moment of peace, I walked along the quiet, moonlit side of the deck. I saw Chloe standing by the railing, looking out at the dark, shimmering water. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe she would understand. "Hey," I said softly, coming to stand beside her. She startled, then offered me a small, tight smile. "Hey, Jessica, it's a beautiful night." "It is," I agreed. We stood in silence for a moment. The only sound, the gentle hum of the engine. I had to try. "Chloe. About earlier. The gift." Her posture stiffened immediately. She didn't look at me, keeping her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Oh. That. You know Harvey? His sense of humor can be an acquired taste." But it wasn't just him. I pressed, my voice dropping to a whisper. It was everyone. The way they looked at me. She finally turned to face me, and in the dim light, I could see the conflict in her eyes. There was a flicker of sympathy, but it was quickly extinguished, replaced by a practiced neutrality. "Listen, Jessica," she said, her voice kind but firm. "Here's a piece of advice. For what it's worth. This family, they have their own way of doing things. They test people. The best thing you can do is just to let it roll off your back. Don't give them a reaction. Don't make waves. It's just easier that way." She gave my arm a quick, dismissive pat. "Don't think too much about it." And with that, she turned and headed back toward the light and the laughter, leaving me alone in the dark. The door wasn't just closed, it was locked. I was completely on my own. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, Harvey approached me again. This time, his entire demeanor had changed. The irritation was gone, replaced by a look of profound, heart-wrenching guilt. He sat on the bed beside me, taking my hands in his. They were warm and strong. "Jess," he began, his voice low and sincere. "I am so sorry. And I'm an idiot. There's something I have to tell you." I waited, my heart suddenly beating a little faster. "The bracelet. It wasn't your real gift?" he said, looking deep into my eyes. "Your real gift fell through at the very last second." And I panicked. I was angry and embarrassed. And I acted like a complete jerk. I stared at him, confused. What was the real gift? It took a deep breath, like he was about to make a grand confession. "You know that cat you're obsessed with on TikTok, Mr. Fluffles, the one with the grumpy face that you've been showing me videos of since we started dating?" My breath caught. I did. I loved that cat. Its silly videos had been a source of genuine joy for me during some tough times. "Yes." "Well, he said, a small, sad smile playing on his lips. The owner lives near the port we docked at today. I've been arranging it for months. I paid them a ridiculous amount of money for a private meet and greet. Right here on the yacht. You were going to be the last person to get a gift. It was going to be this huge, perfect surprise. Just for you. He shook his head, looking disgusted with himself. But they canceled on me this morning, an hour before we set sail. Said they had a family emergency. And I just saw red. I was so mad at them. And so mad at myself for my perfect plan falling apart. That when it was your turn, I just grabbed the stupidest thing I could find. It was a moronic, childish thing to do. And I took my anger out on you. There's no excuse for it. I'm so sorry. Honey. The story was so detailed, so specific. It explained everything: his anger, the secrecy, the bizarre choice of a replacement gift. It painted him not as cruel, but as a flawed man who had tried to do something wonderful and failed. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made me cry washed over me. He wasn't a monster. He was just my husband, who had tried and failed to do something sweet. I wanted to believe him, desperately. The alternative that he had deliberately humiliated me for sport was too dark to contemplate. Oh, Harvey, I whispered, tears welling in my eyes for a completely different reason now. I leaned forward and hugged him, burying my face in his shoulder. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. No. I'm sorry, he murmured into my hair, holding me tight. I should have just told you. Can you forgive me? Of course, I said, my voice thick with emotion. And in that moment, I did. A fragile peace settled between us. But later, much later, when the yacht was quiet and Harvey was breathing deeply beside me in the dark, I was still wide awake. A tiny, persistent splinter of doubt was lodged in my mind. It was all a little too perfect. A little too neat. Just check. A small voice in my head whispered, it won't hurt to just check. Slowly, carefully, I slipped out of bed. I took my phone into the ensuite bathroom, closing the heavy door with a soft click. My hands were shaking as I sat on the edge of the cold marble tub. I opened the TikTok app. My thumb hovered over the search bar. This was stupid. I was being paranoid. I should trust my husband. But I typed it in anyway. Mr. Fluffles. His page loaded instantly. The familiar grumpy face stared back at me from the screen. My heart was pounding. I scrolled down, my eyes scanning the dates of the recent posts. And then I saw it. A video posted just 8 hours ago. It was a clip of Mr. Fluffles wearing a tiny cowboy hat. The caption read, having a blast at the Austin Pet Expo, so great to meet all our Texan fans. Below it was another post from yesterday, showing the cat in a travel carrier at an airport. The geotag was clear, Austin Bergstrom International Airport, Austin, Texas, a city over 1,000 miles away from the Florida Keys. I stared at the screen, the cheerful music from the video sounding tinny and mocking in the silent bathroom. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a lie. It was a performance. An elaborate, intricate, and utterly contemptuous lie, constructed for the sole purpose of managing my feelings, of making me feel guilty for being hurt. He hadn't just humiliated me. He thought I was an idiot, too stupid to ever figure it out. The image of his sincere, remorseful face flashed in my mind, and I felt a wave of nausea. I looked at myself in the vast mirror above the sink. My face was pale. my eyes wide with a horrifying cristalline clarity. The man sleeping in the next room wasn't just a jerk. He was a stranger. A puppeteer who had just shown me my strings. I looked down at my wrist. The ugly blue plastic bracelet was still there. My hand moved with a calm deliberate slowness I didn't recognize as my own. I peeled the cheap plastic off my skin. It didn't make a sound. I didn't throw it in the trash. Instead, I walked over to his side of the gleaming double vanity. Next to his expensive cologne and electric razor, I placed the bracelet right on the marble countertop, coiled like a small, blue snake, where he would be sure to find it in the morning. It was not an act of anger. It was a verdict. I slept. That was the strangest part. After placing the bracelet on the marble counter, a silent testament to his deceit, I slipped back into the cavernous bed. I lay on the very edge of the mattress, my back to him, creating as much distance as the space would allow. I didn't toss or turn. I simply closed my eyes, and a profound, chilling calm washed over me, pulling me down into a deep and dreamless sleep. It wasn't the sleep of peace or contentment. It was the sleep of finality. The kind of heavy, absolute rest that comes after a long and brutal war has finally ended. A ceasefire had been declared in my own heart. When I woke, the morning sun was streaming through the porthole, painting a bright stripe across the expensive carpet. For a split second, that hazy, disoriented moment between sleep and consciousness, I forgot where I was. Then it all came rushing back: the yacht, the gifts, the lie. But the shame and hurt from the day before were gone. In their place was a cold, hard clarity, like a landscape the morning after a blizzard, where every line is sharp and unforgiving. Harvey was still asleep, breathing the deep, untroubled breaths of a man with no conscience. I looked at him. Really looked at him. Maybe for the first time in our entire relationship, I saw not the charming, handsome man I had fallen in love with, but a collection of features. A stranger. I catalogued the way his mouth hung slightly open, the faint lines around his eyes that weren't from smiling but from squinting in judgment. The love I had felt for him was gone. It hadn't faded slowly. It had been murdered in the middle of the night by a lie about a TikTok cat. Quietly, I slipped out of bed and went into the bathroom. The blue plastic bracelet was exactly where I had left it. A few moments later, Harvey stirred. I heard the bed creak. Then his footsteps. He appeared in the doorway of the bathroom, scrubbing a hand over his face. "Morning," he mumbled. Then he saw it. He stopped, his eyes fixing on the bracelet. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "Really? Jess, we're still doing this. I thought we were past it." He picked it up, dangling it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were something foul. I didn't say a word. I just continued brushing my teeth, my movements calm and measured, and met his eyes in the mirror. "He apologized," he said, his voice taking on that familiar, impatient edge. "I explained everything. Are you going to hold this one stupid mistake over my head forever?" I rinsed, wiped my mouth, and turned to face him. "No, Harvey," I said, my voice even and cool. "I'm not going to hold it over your head at all." His face relaxed into a smug little smile. He thought he'd won. He tossed the bracelet into the small trash can beside the vanity with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Good. Now, are you coming for breakfast? Mom wants to dock in a few hours and she's already in a mood." He walked out without waiting for a reply, confident I would follow like I always did. I watched the blue bracelet sitting atop a discarded tissue in the bin. It looked exactly like what it was trash. I needed to talk to someone who lived outside this gilded cage. I needed an anchor to reality before this place made me believe I was the crazy one. As soon as I was dressed, I took my phone and found a secluded spot on the lower deck. Hidden from view, my fingers shook as I dialed my sister's number. "Sarah," I whispered when she picked up. "Jess, are you okay? You sound weird." Her voice was warm and familiar. A lifeline, and then it all came pouring out of me. Not in a flood of tears, but in a quiet, steady, factual torrent. I told her about the gift ceremony. The looks on their faces. Harvey's initial dismissal of my feelings. And then I told her about the lie. The perfect, detailed, manipulative story about Mr. Fluffles. And then, "Sarah," I said, my voice barely audible. I checked. The cat. He's in Texas. He's been in Texas all weekend. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing. "Oh, honey," she finally said. And her voice was filled with a cold fury that mirrored my own. "That is monstrous." I thought I was going crazy. I whispered. He made me feel so ungrateful. So dramatic. "No," Sarah said, her voice firm. Cutting through my last vestiges of doubt. "Listen to me. Jess, this isn't just about him being a rich jerk. This isn't a stupid mistake. A man who can build a lie that intricate, that specific, just to manipulate you into forgiving him. That's not normal. That is calculated. He's not just a jerk. He's a puppeteer. And he thinks you're his favorite puppet. You need to get out of there." Hearing her say it, hearing the truth I already knew reflected back at me from the outside world, solidified something inside me. The last of the fog cleared. "I know," I said. "That's the plan." After I hung up, I went back to the cabin. Harvey was gone. Probably on the upper deck with his family, performing the role of the charming host. The room felt quiet and safe for the first time. I moved with a new sense of purpose. I opened my suitcase and began to pack. Not everything, just the essentials. I left the expensive dresses he'd bought me hanging in the closet. I left the jewelry he'd gifted me in their velvet boxes. I packed the worn paperback copy of my favorite novel. I packed my laptop, which held the manuscript I was editing. The career that was mine. I packed my passport, my wallet, and a simple change of clothes that I had owned long before I ever met him. I was packing up my own life, shedding the costume I had been wearing for the past year. I zipped the small carry-on bag and slid it under the bed. Out of sight. When I went back on deck, the performance was in full swing. Harvey was telling some long, animated story, and his family was laughing on cue. He saw me, and his face lit up with that practiced, public smile. He patted the empty seat beside him. "There she is. We were just talking about that disastrous ski trip to Aspen." I sat down, my back straight, and I smiled. I played the part of the dutiful wife. I listened to his story. I laughed at the right moments. I could feel his hand on my knee. A possessive, confident weight. But to me, it felt like the touch of a stranger. And I felt nothing at all. He was so sure of himself. So confident that he had fixed everything with his perfect lie. He even leaned over and whispered, "See, everything's okay now," squeezing my knee for emphasis. He had no idea he was sitting next to a ghost. He couldn't see that the woman he thought he knew had already left the building. Hours later, The low hum of the engine finally changed, and I felt the gentle bump of the yacht coming up against the dock. The trip was over. People started to move, gathering their things, making plans. I just need to run into town for a few things, I said to Harvey, my voice light and casual. I'll grab a cab and meet you all back at the house in a couple of hours. Okay, honey, he said, barely looking up from his phone, already coordinating dinner plans. Don't be too long. He leaned in to kiss me, but I turned my head slightly so it landed on my cheek. He didn't seem to notice. I walked back to the cabin, my heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. I pulled my bag from under the bed, took one last look around the room that had been my prison, and walked out. I didn't look back. Walking down the gangplank onto the solid ground of the dock felt like stepping into a new life. I walked past the fancy cars waiting for Harvey's family and didn't slow down until I reached the main road. I hailed the first taxi I saw. The airport. Please, I said, sliding into the back seat. The drive was a blur of palm trees and blue sky. I watched the marina and the multi-million-dollar yachts shrink in the rearview mirror until they were just white specks against the sea. At the airport, I walked directly to the ticket counter. I need one ticket on the next flight out, I told the agent. To where she asked, her fingers poised over the keyboard. I gave her the name of my hometown. A city 3 states and a world away. She found a seat on a flight leaving in 90 minutes. I paid with my own credit card. The flimsy paper of the boarding pass felt like the most valuable thing I had ever held. I found a quiet corner in the bustling departure lounge and sat down. And only then, surrounded by the anonymous hum of strangers, did I allow myself to breathe. I had done it. I was out. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text message from Harvey. Where are you? It's been over an hour. Everyone's waiting. His words were laced with that familiar tone of ownership and impatience. My fingers were steady as I began to type. There was no anger. No long explanation. Just the simple, unvarnished truth. I typed out the words I had been rehearsing in my head for hours. The verdict I had reached in the middle of the night. I wrote, your reaction to my being hurt. And more importantly, the elaborate and cruel lie you constructed to cover it up. Showed me that you are not the partner I thought you were. You are not the person I want to spend my life with. I have decided to end our relationship. I read it over once, then hit send. The delivered receipt appeared almost instantly. À moment later, his reply came. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a question. It was pure, unadulterated manipulation. I had hoped we could be honest and start fresh after this. He wrote, but it seems only one of us is mature enough to work through the other's flaws. I stared at the message. A cold, bitter smile touching my lips. He was still trying to play the game. Still trying to make this my fault. I didn't reply. I just watched the 3 little dots appear and disappear as he typed and deleted. His frustration palpable even through the screen. My silence was my new power. And it was driving him crazy. Finally, a new message popped up. It was longer this time. This was the one that would change everything. The one that would prove, beyond any doubt, that I had made the only choice I could. He wrote, fine. Go. But good luck finding anyone else. Because no real man would ever respect someone who clearly has so little respect for her own body. I read the message once. Then I read it again. The words glowed on the screen, stark and ugly in the sterile airport lighting. No real man would ever respect someone who clearly has so little respect for her own body. There was no sting. There was no fresh wave of pain. No hot rush of tears. If I felt anything, it was a profound and surreal sense of calm, the kind of calm that comes when the hurricane has finally passed, and you step outside to see the wreckage under a clear, quiet sky. The destruction is absolute. But the storm is over. This message wasn't an insult. It was a confession. In his final, desperate attempt to wound me, to reassert his dominance, Harvey had accidentally handed me the one thing I didn't know I still needed: a perfect, unassailable piece of evidence. He was showing me the full, unfiltered contents of his soul. And it was as shallow and toxic as I had finally allowed myself to believe. He didn't see me as a partner, or a wife, or even a person. He saw me as an accessory, an object whose value was directly tied to his ownership of it. My respect for my body was only important in the context of it belonging to him. My decision to leave him, to reclaim myself, had, in his mind, voided my warranty. Before, I had felt sure of my decision. Now, I felt serene. He had just taken every lingering scrap of doubt, every whisper of what if, and incinerated it with his own words. He had given me the gift of certainty. My thumb, which had been hovering over the keyboard, moved with a newfound purpose. It wasn't shaking anymore. I didn't type a reply. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I tapped on his name at the top of the screen, opening his contact profile. The photo he'd chosen stared back at me, one of him on the yacht, squinting into the sun, the picture of effortless wealth and power. I scrolled down past the phone numbers and the email address, and there it was. The option I needed. Block this caller. My thumb hovered over the words for a single, significant heartbeat. This was more than just a function on a phone. It was an act of severance. It was a door being slammed, bolted, and barricaded. It was the final word. And it was mine. I pressed the screen. A confirmation box appeared. A final. Digital gatekeeper. Are you sure you want to block this contact? A small, genuine smile touched my lips. I'm sure, I whispered to myself. I tapped block contact. And just like that, he was gone. The message thread vanished. His name disappeared from my recent calls. It was as if he had never existed in my digital world. The silence that followed was the most peaceful sound I had ever heard. The endless stream of his demands, his justifications, his manipulations, it had all been cut off at the source. My phone, which for the last year had felt like a leash, was finally just a tool again. It was mine. I took a deep breath. A real one. That seemed to start from my toes and fill every corner of my lungs. I hadn't realized how shallow my breathing had become, how tense the muscles in my shoulders and neck were until they finally, blessedly, released. It was a physical unburdening, as if I had been carrying a heavy, invisible weight for so long I had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. A tinny voice crackled over the PA system, announcing the pre-boarding for my flight. My flight. The words sounded like a promise. It was my cue. As I stood and gathered my small bag, I allowed myself one last thought of him. I pictured him, not with anger, but with a kind of detached pity. I saw him on that magnificent yacht, surrounded by all his beautiful, expensive things. I saw him staring at his phone, his handsome face twisting in confusion as his carefully crafted insults failed to deliver on amices. I saw him typing furiously, sending volley after volley of venom into a void, not understanding why his power had suddenly been cut off. I pictured his frustration curdling into impotent rage. the rage of a king who discovers his edicts no longer have any meaning because his subject has simply walked out of the kingdom. He could scream all he wanted. I would no longer be there to hear it. The flight was a liminal space, a quiet hum of recycled air between my old life and whatever came next. I watched the coastline of Florida, the playground of the rich and careless, shrink below me until it was nothing more than a green and blue smear. With every mile that passed, I felt lighter. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. There was no cinematic montage of my triumphant new life. Healing, I learned, is a much quieter process. It was unpacking my small bag in the comforting, familiar quiet of my own apartment. It was the simple, profound pleasure of making my own coffee in my own chipped mug. It was calling Sarah and hearing her say, "I'm so damn proud of you," her voice thick with emotion. It was burying myself in my work, in the world of words and stories that had been my passion long before it had been dismissed as quaint. My life was smaller now, but it was infinitely more real. I had traded a gilded cage for a space that was entirely my own, and it felt like the grandest kingdom in the world. There were no more performances. There was no more walking on eggshells. There was just the quiet, steady rhythm of my own life. A life I was rebuilding from the ground up. One rainy Saturday, a few months later, I was curled up on my sofa, scrolling idly through my phone. And then, I saw him, Mr. Fluffles. The grumpy-faced cat was wearing a ridiculous little raincoat, and the caption was something about hating Mondays. I didn't feel a pang of sadness or a jolt of anger. I just smiled. It was a genuine, uncomplicated smile. That silly, oblivious cat, the centerpiece of Harvey's most elaborate deception, had unintentionally become the key that unlocked my cage. He was an absurd, furry little symbol of my freedom. The blue plastic bracelet was the most honest gift Harvey ever gave me. He meant it as an insult, a way to put me in my place, to remind me that I was a promotional item in the multi-billion-dollar corporation of his life. But what he didn't realize was that he had handed me the truth. He had shown me, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what I was worth to him, and in doing so, he forced me to finally confront what I was worth to myself. My value wasn't something he could bestow with a diamond bracelet or take away with a piece of plastic. It wasn't up for negotiation. My self-respect wasn't a gift he could give me. It was a boundary I had to build myself. And walking away from him, blocking his number in that noisy airport, and choosing the quiet dignity of my own life over the loud spectacle of his, that was me. Laying the first stone,